There are places people fight to get into, cities with opportunity, markets with demand, regions where businesses compete for space. And then, there are places no one is allowed to enter. This was one of them. For decades, the area existed behind barriers. Fences stretched for miles. Warning signs covered every entrance. Access roads were blocked long before you could even see what was inside. People who lived nearby didn't talk about it much. Not because they didn't know, but because it had always been that way. Restricted, closed, untouchable. If you drove close enough, you'd notice something strange. The land itself didn't look abandoned. It looked preserved, undisturbed. Wide open fields, industrial structures hidden in the distance, roads that seemed to lead somewhere, but stopped before anyone could follow them. No activity, no development, no explanation, just silence. Officially, the place had a purpose, but that purpose wasn't public. Records were limited, information was controlled, and over time, the reason didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the rule. No one goes inside. And in business, there's something unusual about restrictions. Because the more something is limited, the more people begin to wonder why. For years, no one asked. The world had plenty of other places to build, plenty of cities expanding, plenty of regions offering incentives. There was no reason to question a place that didn't allow entry. Until something changed. Not inside the place, but outside it. The world was shifting. Industries were growing faster than infrastructure could support. Technology demanded more space, more power, more control over land. And suddenly, available locations were disappearing. Cities became overcrowded. Industrial zones filled up. Land prices increased. Competition intensified. And for the first time, companies started running out of options. That's when attention moved somewhere unexpected, toward the place no one could enter. At first, it wasn't serious. Just curiosity. Why was that land restricted? How big was it? Could it be used? But curiosity quickly turned into something else. Interest. Because when analysts began studying the area, they noticed something unusual. The location was perfect, positioned between major transport routes, connected to power infrastructure, surrounded by developing regions, and yet, completely unused. No competition, no development, no noise, just potential. But there was one problem. No one could access it. That's where Marcus Hale enters the story. Marcus Hale was 41 years old, a strategic development advisor known for working on projects most people considered too complicated. Not because they were impossible, but because they involved barriers others didn't want to deal with. Regulations, restrictions, unclear ownership. He didn't avoid those problems. He studied them. Because in his experience, the most valuable opportunities were usually hidden behind the most resistance. And this place had more resistance than anything he had seen before. Marcus didn't start with the land. He started with the rules. Why was it restricted? Who controlled it? What would it take to change that? The answers weren't simple. Layers of regulation. Old policies that had never been updated. Agreements that no longer matched current realities. It wasn't just locked. It was forgotten. But that's where Marcus saw something others missed. Because when something is forgotten, it often hasn't been reevaluated. And when it hasn't been reevaluated, it might not need to stay the way it is. So he did something most people wouldn't even attempt. He started asking for access. Not publicly, not loudly, but strategically. Meetings, proposals, discussions with people who had influence over the land. At first, the answer was predictable. No, the rules had been in place for too long. There was no reason to change them. No urgency, no pressure. But Marcus understood something important. Decisions don't change because of requests. They change because of pressure. And pressure was building. Because while the land remained restricted, demand outside was increasing. Companies were expanding faster than available space. Investors were searching for new regions. Governments were looking for ways to support growth. And slowly, the question changed. It wasn't, why should we open this place? It became, why are we keeping it closed? That shift didn't happen overnight. But once it started, it didn't stop. Because now, the place wasn't just restricted. It was valuable. And when something becomes valuable, people don't ignore it anymore. They compete for it. By the time the first serious proposal reached decision makers, something had already changed. The place no one was allowed to enter was no longer invisible. It was becoming the center of attention. And what happens next would turn a forgotten restricted zone into one of the most contested pieces of land in the region. By the time the first serious proposal reached the people in control of the land, the situation had already changed. What was once ignored was now being watched. Not by one company, not by one investor, but by many, quietly, carefully, because no one wanted to move too early, and no one wanted to reveal how valuable the place might actually be. Marcus Hale understood exactly what was happening. The moment something restricted starts attracting attention, it becomes competitive. But competition without access creates tension, and tension creates pressure. So instead of pushing harder, Marcus slowed down. He didn't try to rush approval. He focused on positioning, because he knew something most people didn't. Access wouldn't be given to everyone. It would be given to someone, and whoever moved first would control everything that followed. So Marcus built a different kind of proposal, not just about development, but about control. He mapped out a phased opening of the land, limited access, controlled expansion, infrastructure development tied to long-term agreements. Instead of removing restrictions, he suggested redefining them. Because restrictions weren't the problem, uncontrolled access was. And suddenly, the idea became more acceptable. Not opening the place completely, but unlocking it strategically. That was the turning point. For the first time in decades, the answer wasn't no. It was maybe. But maybe, in this situation, didn't slow things down. It accelerated everything, because word had already spread, and now companies started moving. Not publicly, but aggressively. Private meetings, back-channel discussions, offers being prepared before access was even confirmed, because they understood what was at stake. The first company inside would define the entire future of the location, and no one wanted to be second. Marcus, however, wasn't just dealing with companies. He was dealing with time, because every day the land remained closed. Its value increased, and with that value came risk. More attention, more competition, more pressure from groups that had no interest in controlled development. He needed to secure the first move before the situation became uncontrollable. So he focused on one strategy: alignment. Instead of working with multiple companies, he chose one, a large infrastructure firm that didn't just need space, but needed long-term dominance. A company willing to invest heavily, if it meant controlling access before anyone else could. The deal wasn't simple. It wasn't fast, but it was strategic. The company wouldn't just build on the land. It would shape how the land was used. Infrastructure, roads, energy systems, security. Everything would be built with one goal: control the entry point. Because whoever controls access controls everything that follows. After months of negotiation, the agreement was approved. Quietly, without headlines, without public attention. But it was real. For the first time in decades, access was granted. Limited, controlled, but enough. The moment the gates opened, everything changed. Construction began immediately. Heavy equipment entered the land. Survey teams mapped the entire region. Initial infrastructure started taking shape, and for the first time, the outside world could see what had been hidden. The land wasn't just large. It was massive, and more importantly, untouched, perfect for development. That's when the second wave began. The companies that had been waiting started reacting, not slowly, not cautiously, aggressively. Offers increased. Proposals multiplied. Partnership requests flooded in. Because now the opportunity was real, and the race had officially started. The company that secured the first access moved fast. They didn't just build. They expanded. They locked key areas, secured infrastructure points, positioned themselves to control future entry. And Marcus watched it all unfold exactly as he predicted. Because the value wasn't just in the land. It was in the timing. Being early, being first, being inside before anyone else. Within a year, the transformation was visible. Not complete, but undeniable. Roads were built where none existed. Energy systems expanded. The first major facility stood at the center of the once restricted zone. And outside the gates, something even more interesting was happening. Crowds. Not physical crowds, but corporate ones. Companies waiting, watching, negotiating, trying to find a way in. Because now the place had something it never had before. Proof. It wasn't just restricted land anymore. It was active, developing, valuable. And in business, once something becomes valuable, it becomes competitive. And once it becomes competitive, it becomes aggressive. What started as curiosity had now turned into a fight. because the place no one was allowed to enter was now the place everyone wanted to control. And what happens next would take that competition to another level. Because once access exists, the real battle begins. Once the gates opened, the silence ended. Not immediately, not loudly, but steadily. Because access changes everything. For decades, the place had existed outside the system. Untouched, unclaimed, uncontested. But now, it was inside the system. And once something enters the system, it becomes part of the game. At first, only a few companies moved. Carefully, strategically, watching each other more than the land itself. Because this wasn't just about building. It was about positioning. The first company had an advantage. They controlled the entry. They shaped the infrastructure. They defined the early rules. But in business, first doesn't mean forever. Because once value is proven, others don't wait. They push. And that's exactly what happened. The second wave didn't arrive with proposals. It arrived with pressure. Large firms began negotiating directly with regulators, not asking for access, but demanding expansion, more land, more entry points, more control, because the restricted zone was no longer just land. It was leverage, the kind of leverage companies build entire strategies around. Marcus Hale saw the shift immediately. What had started as controlled access was turning into competition for control. And competition changes behavior. Because when companies compete, they don't just build, they accelerate. The first company responded fast. They expanded infrastructure beyond their initial plan. More roads, more power capacity, more secured zones. They weren't just developing the land anymore. They were defending it. But the pressure didn't stop. Because outside, the demand kept growing. More industries started paying attention. Logistics companies, energy providers, tech infrastructure firms, even investment groups with no direct connection to the original plan. Because they all saw the same thing. A controlled zone with limited access. An increasing value. Which meant one thing. Scarcity. And scarcity drives price. Within 2 years, the numbers changed dramatically. Land that had once been ignored was now being priced at levels no one expected. Not because of what it was, but because of who wanted it. And how many. That's when the real shift happened. The place was no longer restricted by rules. It was restricted by access. And access was controlled by those already inside. The companies that entered early now had something others couldn't easily replicate. Position, infrastructure control, and most importantly, time. Because every month they operated, they expanded their advantage. And every month others waited. They lost theirs. So the strategies changed. Companies stopped trying to enter directly. They started finding indirect paths, partnerships, joint ventures, secondary agreements with existing operators. Because if you couldn't enter the zone, you aligned with someone who already had. And that created a new layer of competition, not just for land, but for influence. Marcus Hale didn't try to stop it. He expected it. Because this wasn't chaos. It was evolution. The zone had moved from restriction to opportunity, to competition, and now to dominance. By the 4th year, the transformation was undeniable. What had once been empty land behind barriers was now a controlled ecosystem. Multiple large-scale facilities operating inside. Infrastructure expanding outward. Roads connecting zones that had never been accessed before. Energy systems scaling beyond original projections. And outside the gates, the entire region began to change. Support industries appeared first. Logistics hubs, equipment suppliers, service companies. Then came the next wave. Housing developments, commercial spaces, financial services. Because once a central hub grows, everything around it grows with it. The restricted zone didn't just change itself. It changed everything around it. The place that no one could enter was now the center of everything. And then came the moment no one expected. The shift from competition to consolidation. Because when too many players enter a valuable space, the next phase isn't expansion. It's control. Large companies began acquiring smaller ones, merging operations, securing larger sections of land, not just to grow, but to prevent others from growing. Because at this level, it wasn't about building anymore. It was about dominance. Who controls the most land? Who controls the infrastructure? Who controls access? And slowly, the zone stopped looking like a development project and started looking like something else. A controlled network. A system, designed, expanded, and defended by those inside it. Marcus Hale stepped back. Not because the project was over, but because it had reached a point where it no longer needed him. Because the idea had already taken control. The system was running itself. And the place that no one was allowed to enter, had become something far more powerful. A place people couldn't afford to be outside of. Today, if you stand outside the gates, you'll still see the signs. Restrictions, limited access, controlled entry.